we have Olimpia Pilch. Are you in the room? We're looking forward to hearing from you. Yeah, I can see you now. You're welcome. The floor is yours now.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen, so hopefully it all works.
Yes, it should work. Let me see. Dr. Adiola, can you stop sharing or can it? Okay, it's up now.
All right, thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much to Women in Mining Africa for inviting me to speak today. It's been incredibly insightful so far. And like Marilyn, unfortunately, I've had very limited interaction with artisanal small-scale mining, but have spent significant time working on critical mineral supply chains and doing a little bit of work around Africa as well. So I've recently joined a very exciting initiative called the Critical Minerals Africa Group, which is a platform for public and private entities to come together and focus on some of the challenges facing critical mineral supply chains. And most importantly, it's all about giving Africa a seat at the table when it comes to some of those discussions on policy, on geopolitics, on the energy transition that various governments are having around the globe. So I'll be giving you a bit of a zoomed out perspective on ASM and how it can fit into energy transition supply chains and how it can be integrated. So as we've already heard previously, critical minerals have been mentioned, as well as the need to move further downstream. So I'll also be touching on that in a little while. But I just wanted to focus on the projected increase in demand for critical minerals and how Africa is incredibly well positioned to take advantage of that. So while globally, as a continent, Africa is still at the very beginning of its journey when it comes to building of green supply chains, industrialization, etc. But there's already significant movements, especially in South Africa, with solar panel and wind turbine manufacture, e-bikes and EV components manufacture in Ghana, plus very ambitious plans, for example, AfriVolt trying to establish Africa's very first gigafactory. So with all the demands and all these various nations, North America, Europe, all these jurisdictions wanting to get critical minerals, artisanal small-scale mining already contributes a fair bit to global production. So around 80 to 30% of global cobalt production, 25% of both tantalum and tin production, 6 tons production will indicate various different critical minerals being extracted and shipped out of the continent. So ASM is likely to continue to grow as this demand expands for energy transition minerals. And the World Bank estimates that we have extracted 550 million metric tons of copper over the past 5,000 years. And we now need to extract all of that again in the next 25 years just to meet enough of the demand for low carbon technologies. And that doesn't even consider all the different scenarios with electronics and growth of population. So we do have a huge challenge in front of us. And speaking from a very recent perspective, it takes a very, very long time in the West to bring new mines online. So Africa is very well positioned to take advantage of that and to be at the heart of the energy transition. So Benchmark Minerals Intelligence predicts that we're going to need, by 2030, some 284 new nickel, lithium, graphite, and cobalt mines. These are average-sized mines. But of course, outside of the commercial sector, we also have the artisanal small-scale mining sector, which will be contributing significantly to the energy transition supply chains. But when we talk about the energy transition, I know that in the Western world, we're always sold the idea that we are building a better tomorrow, but it's very hard to justify building a better tomorrow if we are utilizing child labor, if the practices on the ground are violating human rights, there's lack of health and safety. So we really need to think about moving further downstream in terms of attracting the private capital to build processing and refining facilities to really disrupt the existing system. So at the moment, what typically happens is ore is extracted in Africa. There's various middlemen in between. Eventually, that all ends up on a ship and it heads over to China. Now, China has done very well for itself in terms of growing its manufacturing center by exploiting Africa's resources and by really leveraging child labour, being able to pay people less for the ore than they would normally have to. So if we look at GDP comparison back in 2023, China's GDP was 17.66 trillion US dollars in comparison to Africa's combined GDP that same year, which was just 3.1 trillion US dollars. And the year beforehand, in 2022, the DRC exported nearly 6 billion US dollars of cobalt to China, and Zambia exported almost 2 billion US dollars in raw copper to China. So there's already quite a bit of extraction. And if that demand ramps up, if we start needing more critical minerals, there'll be more opportunities for people in the artisanal sector to extract those. But we need to make sure that they don't continue being exploited, and that we flip the system from being set up to benefit certain actors to actually ensuring that we have strong and resilient systems within Africa. So processing and refining facilities, which can collaborate with local cooperatives and with local different groups and stakeholders. But to drive some of the changes, we really need to do that through governance, and we've already touched on the importance of governance. So taking a top-down approach, starting at policy level, so national policy, building out, making sure that at local government level, there is that will and empowerment to make sure that policy is delivered. But most importantly, it needs to focus on the people on the ground to ensure that they have what they need, and that any future investments, especially foreign direct investments into some of the value add activities, reflect what is needed to really support the people. So for example, Western investors, as it has already been mentioned, have been a little bit put off by some of the videos, mostly that surface on social media with some of the poor practices. So we need to have a bit of education to make sure that customers in the Western world understand that actually ASM as a sector can provide decent employment, it can provide livelihoods and economic opportunities, especially for women, who can then support their families and provide further opportunities to their families. But we also need to have cost-effective tracing initiatives to be able to discriminate and pinpoint where child labour might be occurring in some of those supply chains. So I think this has been touched on already as well, where OEMs have slightly backed off from collaborating and looking into supply chains, but that now has started to change. OEMs are very much looking at, well, how can we integrate ASM into our supply chains? But there is that demand, especially from Western customers, to be able to prove that no child labour has been involved in the extraction of those critical minerals. There have been several initiatives in the DRC with tagging of different bags of ore coming out of mine sites. To some extent, it has worked. There has been some criticism that it hasn't worked as well as people would have hoped. And of course, if we want to make sure that Africa remains a competitive continent, that the prices do not exceed what customers are willing to pay for that ore. But we have to make sure that primarily the artisanal miners do get the fair price for the ore and are not being exploited. And we also really need to focus on proactive engagement with traditional mining companies. I mean, I've been very happy to hear that small miners are now not just coexisting with ASM, but also actively collaborating. But unfortunately, I'm sure as many of you see on a frequent basis in the media, there is always something floating about around poor relations and exploitation. So there is some long way to go. And of course, good governance, as Marilyn mentioned, at the board level can help solve some of those issues. But most importantly, when different African nations are attracting foreign direct investment or screening some of the people coming in who want to invest in these value chains, it's very important that there is impact investment involved in this, especially focused on women, children, and education, so that the building of supply chains today has very long-term and multi-generational benefits in terms of creating education placements, being able to give women the ability to upskill, learn new skills, and really take charge of their lives. Now, if we're looking at multi-generational benefits, the children that go to school today can become future engineers, they can become future directors of companies, but they have to have that education, they have to have those opportunities first. And of course, with foreign direct investments, a lot of Western companies, for instance, are required to prove some kind of ESG credentials, what they're doing on the ground, and good governance, especially on the government level or the government side, can give companies a bit of a poke and say, actually, you really need to do this. You need to focus on education. You need to focus on how you can empower women. So we have a long way to go, but as we already know, there's critical minerals in the global supply chains. There will be more ASM-derived critical minerals in wider global energy transition supply chains. So we really need to work collectively, not just as a continent, but on a global scale of how do we make it safer for the people doing this work, and how do we make sure that they have opportunities to have better future, better livelihoods because of the energy transition. So